The late spring blizzard hit my mountain ranch without warning, dropping 2 feet of snow in 12 hours and cutting off all access to the outside world. I'd been living alone on the remote Colorado property for 5 years, running a small cattle operation and enjoying the solitude that came with being 30 miles from the nearest neighbor. On the second morning after the storm, I was checking on my livestock when I heard a sound that didn't belong. A weak whimpering coming from beneath a massive pine that had fallen during the night. The tree had created a natural shelter, and underneath it, barely visible in the snow, was what appeared to be a tiny puppy. The creature was nearly frozen, its golden brown fur matted with ice and snow. It couldn't have been more than 6 weeks old, with oversized paws that suggested it would grow into a large dog. I assumed it was a German Shepherd mix, probably abandoned by someone who couldn't handle the responsibility of raising a large breed puppy. I scooped up the half-dead animal and rushed it back to my cabin, where I spent the next several hours warming it by the fire and trying to get some milk substitute into its system. The puppy was so weak it could barely lift its head, but there was something in its amber eyes that suggested a fierce will to survive. "Come on, little guy," I whispered as I wrapped him in warm towels. "You're safe now." I named him Scout, partly because of his alert expression, and partly because I hoped he'd grow into a good ranch dog who could help me keep track of the cattle. Over the next few days, as Scout slowly regained his strength, I marveled at his resilience and intelligence. He seemed to understand everything I said, learned his name immediately, and showed an unusual grace in his movements that I attributed to good breeding. I had no idea I was raising something far more extraordinary than an abandoned puppy. Chapter 2. Early Signs. As Scout recovered and began to grow, I noticed characteristics that seemed unusual for a typical dog, but I attributed them to his mixed breeding and the trauma of his early abandonment. His ears were more pointed than rounded, his tail was longer and more muscular than most dogs, and his paws were disproportionately large, even for a puppy that would clearly grow into a big animal. Most striking were his eyes, amber-colored with an intensity that seemed almost human in its intelligence. Scout would watch me work around the ranch with a focus that was both endearing and slightly unsettling. He learned commands faster than any dog I'd ever trained, often anticipating what I wanted before I gave the instruction. "You're going to be one smart ranch dog," I told him as he followed me through my daily chores, already showing the protective instincts that would make him valuable for guarding livestock. Scout's appetite was enormous, even for a growing puppy. He preferred raw meat to kibble, and I found myself buying larger and larger quantities of food to keep up with his needs. The local feed store owner commented on my purchases during one of my monthly trips to town. "That must be some puppy you've got," he said, loading bags of high-protein dog food into my truck. "Most folks don't need this much food unless they're feeding a whole pack." I laughed it off, explaining that Scout was going to be a large dog and that I wanted to make sure he had proper nutrition during his growth phase. But privately, I was beginning to wonder about his parentage. His growth rate was extraordinary, and his proportions were becoming more unusual as he developed. By 3 months old, Scout was already the size of a 6-month-old German Shepherd, with a lean, muscular build that suggested power and speed. His movements were becoming more fluid and graceful, almost cat-like in their precision. Still, he was affectionate and loyal, sleeping by my bed and following me everywhere I went on the ranch. Chapter 3. Growing Larger. By his first birthday, Scout had grown into a magnificent animal that stood nearly 3 feet at the shoulder and weighed close to 80 pounds. His coat had developed into a beautiful golden brown color with darker markings around his face and ears. He was undoubtedly the most impressive dog I'd ever seen, but I was beginning to have doubts about his breed. "That's no German Shepherd," said Dr. Martinez, the veterinarian who made house calls to remote ranches in our area. She'd come to check on one of my cattle and had gotten her first look at Scout. I've never seen a dog with those proportions or that coat pattern. She examined Scout thoroughly, noting his unusual dental structure, his oversized paws, and his remarkably flexible spine. "Have you considered that he might be a wolf hybrid?" she asked. "Some of his characteristics suggest wild canine genetics. The possibility had occurred to me, but Scout's temperament seemed too gentle and domesticated for a wolf cross. He was protective of the ranch and wary of strangers, but he'd never shown aggression toward me or the livestock. If anything, he seemed to have appointed himself as guardian of the entire property. Scout's hunting instincts were becoming more pronounced as he matured. He could track scents across miles of rough terrain, and his stealth was remarkable for such a large animal. I'd often lose sight of him during our walks, only to have him appear silently beside me minutes later. "Where do you go when you disappear like that?" I'd ask him, and he'd look at me with those intelligent amber eyes as if he understood the question but couldn't provide an answer. His vocalizations were also unusual. Instead of typical barking, Scout made a variety of sound. Low rumbles, chirping noises, and occasionally a call that sounded almost like a bird's whistle. I'd never heard a dog make sounds like that, but I assumed it was just another quirk of his mixed breeding. Chapter 4. The Perfect Companion. Despite my growing questions about Scout's origins, he had become the perfect ranch companion. His intelligence and loyalty were extraordinary, and his presence had transformed my solitary life into something richer and more meaningful. Scout seemed to understand the rhythms of ranch work instinctively. He knew when it was time to check on the cattle, when to patrol the property boundaries, and when to simply stay close to the cabin and keep me company during long winter evenings. His protective instincts were perfectly calibrated, alert to genuine threats, but calm around familiar visitors. "That's the finest working dog I've ever seen," said Jim Patterson, a neighboring rancher who occasionally helped me with cattle drives. "Where'd you find him?" I told the story of discovering Scout during the blizzard, but I could see Jim studying the animal with the same puzzled expression that Dr. Martinez had shown. Scout's size and build were becoming impossible to explain as normal dog genetics. By his second year, Scout weighed over 100 pounds and moved with a fluid grace that was mesmerizing to watch. His stamina was unlimited. He could run alongside my ATV for hours without showing fatigue, and his ability to navigate rough mountain terrain was superior to any dog I'd known. Most remarkably, Scout seemed to have developed an almost telepathic connection with me. He would often respond to my thoughts before I spoke them aloud, appearing at my side when I needed help, or positioning himself between me and potential dangers before I was aware they existed. "It's like he can read my mind," I told Dr. Martinez during one of her visits. "Sometimes I think he understands me better than most people do." She watched Scout moving through the pasture with his characteristic silent grace and shook her head. "I've been a veterinarian for 20 years, she said, "and I've never seen an animal quite like him." Chapter 5. Unusual Behaviors. As Scout entered his third year, his behaviors became increasingly difficult to explain through normal canine psychology. He had developed hunting patterns that were unlike any dog I'd observed, often disappearing for hours at a time and returning with evidence of successful hunts that he never shared with me. I found caches of bones and remains hidden in various locations around the property, always carefully concealed and organized in ways that suggested planning and forethought. When I asked other ranchers about this behavior, they looked puzzled. "Dogs don't usually cache food like that," Jim Patterson told me. "That's more like what you'd see from wild predators, wolves maybe, or big cats." Scout's relationship with the livestock was also evolving in unexpected ways. While he remained protective of my cattle, he had begun treating them more like a predator managing prey than a dog guarding domestic animals. He would position himself strategically to observe their movements, and I occasionally caught him practicing what looked like hunting approaches, though he never actually threatened the animals. His nocturnal activities were becoming more pronounced. Scout would often leave the cabin after I went to sleep, returning before dawn with his coat carrying scents of the deep wilderness. I tried following him once, but his ability to move silently through the forest far exceeded my tracking skills. "Where do you go at night?" I asked him one morning, noticing fresh scratches on his legs that suggested he'd been climbing or navigating particularly rough terrain. Scout's response was a low rumble that I'd learned to interpret as contentment, but his amber eyes held secrets that I was beginning to realize I might never fully understand. The most unsettling development was his reaction to certain sound and scents. When the wind carried calls from the deep mountains, sounds I couldn't identify but that seemed to come from large predators, Scout would become intensely alert, his entire body focused on listening to communications I couldn't hear. Chapter 6. The Visiting Wildlife. During Scout's third year on the ranch, I began noticing an increase in wildlife activity around the property. Mountain lions, bears, and wolves that had previously avoided the area were now making regular appearances, though they seemed more curious than threatening. Most remarkably, these wild animals showed no fear of Scout. I watched through binoculars as he interacted with a pack of wolves that had wandered onto the property, and instead of the territorial confrontation I expected, the encounter looked more like a social meeting between old friends. "That's not normal behavior," Dr. Martinez said when I described what I'd witnessed. "Domestic dogs and wild wolves usually maintain clear boundaries. What you're describing suggests Scout is being accepted as part of their social structure." The mountain lions were even more puzzling. I'd seen several different cats observing the ranch from various vantage points, and they showed no concern about Scout's presence. In fact, they seemed to be watching him with what looked like recognition or familiarity. One morning, I found tracks in the snow around the cabin that told an extraordinary story. Scout's paw prints were intermingled with those of a large mountain lion, and the pattern suggested they had walked together rather than one tracking the other. The tracks led to a clearing where the snow was disturbed in ways that indicated the two animals had spent considerable time together. "Scout," I called when he returned that afternoon. "What's going on with you and the local wildlife?" His response was that same low rumble, but this time it was accompanied by a look that seemed almost apologetic. As if he knew he was keeping secrets but couldn't explain them to me, I began setting up trail cameras around the property to document these interactions, hoping to understand what was happening during Scout's nocturnal adventures. The footage I captured over the following weeks would challenge everything I thought I knew about animal behavior and the creature I'd been living with for 3 years. Chapter 7. The Camera Evidence. The trail camera footage revealed interactions that defied everything I understood about predator behavior and domestic animal relationships. Scout was clearly communicating with mountain lions, wolves, and bears using body language and vocalizations that suggested a shared understanding I couldn't comprehend. In one particularly striking video, Scout approached a large mountain lion that was resting on a boulder overlooking the ranch. Instead of the territorial confrontation I expected, the two animals touched noses in what appeared to be a greeting between family members. They then spent several minutes engaged in what looked like a conversation, with Scout making his unusual chirping sounds and the mountain lion responding with soft vocalizations. "This is unprecedented," Dr. Martinez said when I showed her the footage. "I've never seen anything like this in 30 years of working with both domestic and wild animals. Scout is being accepted by apex predators as one of their own." The most revealing footage came from a camera I'd positioned near one of Scout's cache sites. The video showed him carefully arranging bones and remains in patterns that seemed ritualistic, almost ceremonial. His movements were precise and purposeful, suggesting behaviors that were instinctual rather than learned. "Those aren't dog behaviors," Dr. Martinez observed. "What you're seeing looks more like the territorial marking and food caching patterns of large cats." I began researching mountain lion behavior and was startled by the similarities to Scout's actions. His hunting patterns, his caching behaviors, his social interactions with other predators, and even his vocalizations all aligned more closely with feline predators than with any canine species. But the most shocking revelation came from footage of Scout's interactions with my cattle. While I'd always assumed he was protecting them, the videos showed him practicing hunting approaches and studying their movements with the focused attention of a predator evaluating prey. "I think we need to consider the possibility that Scout isn't a dog at all," Dr. Martinez said quietly. "His size, his behaviors, his acceptance by wild predators, everything points to him being a mountain lion that was somehow raised as a domestic animal." Chapter 8. The Realization. The possibility that Scout was actually a mountain lion rather than a dog seemed impossible, but the evidence was becoming overwhelming. I spent hours studying photographs and videos of mountain lion cubs, comparing them to my memories of Scout as a puppy, and the similarities were undeniable. Mountain lion cubs are born with spotted coats that fade to solid colors as they mature, and they have the same oversized paws and amber eyes that had characterized Scout from the beginning. Their growth patterns, dietary needs, and behavioral development all matched what I'd observed over the past 3 years. But how is this possible? I asked Dr. Martinez during one of our discussions. Scout has lived with me like a domestic animal. He's affectionate, loyal, and completely non-aggressive toward humans. Mountain lions are actually quite adaptable, she explained. Cubs that are separated from their mothers early enough can imprint on humans and develop domestic behaviors. In the wild, they're solitary animals, but they're also intelligent enough to adapt to unusual circumstances. The realization explained so many of Scout's characteristics that had puzzled me over the years. His silent movement through the forest, his extraordinary hunting abilities, his unusual vocalizations, and his acceptance by wild predators all made perfect sense if he was actually a mountain lion rather than a dog. But it also raised troubling questions about our future together. Mountain lions are powerful predators with instincts that could potentially make them dangerous to humans, regardless of how they were raised. Scout had never shown any aggression toward me, but he was now a fully mature animal weighing over 120 pounds with the natural weapons of an apex predator. What do I do with this information? I asked Dr. Martinez. Scout is my companion, my friend. I can't imagine life on the ranch without him. For now, nothing changes, she advised. Scout has bonded with you and shows no signs of reverting to aggressive wild behavior. But you need to be aware of what he is and respect his true nature. Chapter 9. The Morning of Truth. 3 months after accepting the reality of Scout's true identity, I experienced the moment that would forever change our relationship. I woke before dawn to the sound of low vocalizations outside the cabin. Not Scout's usual morning greetings, but something deeper and more complex. Looking through the window, I saw Scout sitting in the yard facing a massive mountain lion that had emerged from the tree line. The wildcat was clearly an adult male, probably weighing close to 150 pounds, with the scarred face and muscular build of a territorial dominant animal. My first instinct was to grab my rifle and protect Scout from what I assumed was a dangerous confrontation. But as I watched, I realized this wasn't a territorial dispute. It was a reunion. The two animals approached each other with obvious recognition and familiarity. They touched noses, rubbed against each other, and engaged in the kind of social grooming that indicated a close relationship. Scout's body language showed excitement and joy rather than fear or aggression. "Oh my God," I whispered, understanding flooding through me. "That's his father." The interaction continued for nearly an hour, with the two mountain lions communicating through vocalizations and body language that clearly conveyed complex information. Scout's responses suggested he was being welcomed back into a social structure he'd never completely left. When the wild mountain lion finally disappeared back into the forest, Scout remained in the yard for several minutes, looking in the direction his visitor had gone. Then he turned toward the cabin, and for the first time since I'd known him, his amber eyes held a look that was purely wild. He was remembering who he really was. When I stepped onto the porch, Scout approached me, as he always had, seeking the affection and attention that had characterized our relationship for 3 years. But something fundamental had changed. He was no longer a mysterious dog with unusual behaviors. He was a mountain lion who had chosen to live with a human. Chapter 10. The New Dynamic. In the weeks following Scout's reunion with what I believed was his father, our relationship evolved into something unprecedented. Scout remained affectionate and loyal, but he was no longer pretending to be something he wasn't. His movements became more openly feline, his hunting behaviors more pronounced, and his interactions with wild predators more frequent. "He's integrating his two worlds," Dr. Martinez observed during one of her visits. "Scout has learned to be both a wild mountain lion and a domestic companion. It's remarkable adaptation. I had to adjust my own behavior to accommodate Scout's true nature. I stopped expecting him to respond like a dog and began treating him as the intelligent wild predator he was. This meant respecting his need for independence, understanding his hunting instincts, and accepting that our relationship was a partnership between equals rather than a traditional pet-owner dynamic. Scout's nocturnal activities increased, and I often found evidence of his interactions with other mountain lions. Tracks, scent markings, and cached remains indicated that he was maintaining relationships with multiple wild cats while continuing to live primarily at the ranch. "You're living in both worlds now, aren't you?" I said to him one evening as he prepared to leave for one of his night expeditions. "You're Scout the ranch companion, and also a wild mountain lion with his own territory and social connections." His response was a soft, chirping sound that I'd learned to interpret as agreement or acknowledgement. Scout had developed a vocabulary of vocalizations that allowed us to communicate in ways that went beyond typical human-animal interactions. The most remarkable change was in how other wildlife responded to my presence when Scout was with me. Bears, wolves, and other mountain lions that would normally avoid humans showed no fear when Scout was nearby, as if his acceptance of me extended some form of protection or safe passage. I was living with a bridge between the human and wild worlds, and that bridge was transforming my understanding of what was possible between species. Chapter 11. Acceptance and Understanding. A year after Scout's reunion with his father, I had fully accepted our unique relationship and the responsibilities that came with sharing my life with a wild predator. Scout had never shown any aggression toward me, but I remained constantly aware of his true nature and the respect it demanded. "You've created something extraordinary here," Dr. Martinez said during one of her visits. "Scout represents a successful integration between wild and domestic that challenges everything we think we know about predator behavior." Scout's presence had transformed the ranch in unexpected ways. The property had become a neutral zone where wild predators could interact safely, and I often observed behaviors and social dynamics that would be impossible to study in purely wild settings. I documented these interactions through photography and video, creating a record of Scout's unique position as a bridge between worlds. Wildlife researchers from the state university had begun visiting to observe and study the unprecedented relationships Scout had facilitated. "He's teaching us about the flexibility of predator behavior," explained Dr. Sarah Chen, a wildlife biologist who had been studying Scout for several months. "His ability to maintain both domestic and wild relationships suggests that these animals are far more adaptable than we previously understood." Scout seemed to understand his role as an ambassador between species. He was patient with researchers, protective of the ranch and its human inhabitants, and respectful of the wild predators who visited the property. His intelligence and emotional sophistication continued to amaze everyone who observed him. "You're not just my companion anymore," I told him one evening as we watched a family of mountain lions playing in the meadow below the cabin. "You're a teacher, showing all of us what's possible when we respect the intelligence and adaptability of wild animals." Scout's response was a low rumble of contentment, and he moved closer to rest his massive head against my leg, a gesture that perfectly captured the trust and affection that had developed between a human and a wild predator. Chapter 12. The Legacy. 5 years after finding what I thought was an abandoned puppy in a snowstorm, I sit on my porch each evening watching Scout move through his territory with the grace and power of the magnificent predator he's always been. Our relationship has become a testament to the possibility of mutual respect and understanding between humans and wild animals. Scout is now fully mature, weighing nearly 140 pounds and commanding the respect of every predator in the region. He has established his own territory that encompasses the ranch and extends deep into the surrounding wilderness, but he continues to choose our cabin as his primary home base. "He's rewritten the rules," Dr. Chen observed during her most recent visit. Scout has proven that wild predators can maintain complex relationships with humans while preserving their essential wild nature. The research conducted at the ranch has contributed to new understanding of predator intelligence, social flexibility, and the potential for coexistence between humans and large carnivores. Scout's story has been documented in scientific journals and wildlife documentaries, inspiring new approaches to wildlife management and conservation. But for me, Scout remains what he's always been. A loyal companion who chose to share his life with a human despite every instinct that should have driven him back to the wild. Our bond transcends species boundaries and challenges assumptions about what's possible between predator and prey. You could leave anytime, I tell him as he settles beside me for our evening routine. You have a territory, a social network, and all the skills you need to live completely wild. But you choose to stay. Scout's amber eyes meet mine with the same intelligence and affection I've seen since that first day when I pulled a dying cub from beneath a fallen tree. He is both the wild mountain lion he was born to be and the loyal companion he chose to become. As the sun sets over the Colorado mountains, Scout rises and stretches, preparing for another night of patrolling his territory and maintaining the complex relationships he's built between the human and wild worlds. Tomorrow morning, he'll return to the cabin, and we'll continue the extraordinary partnership that began with a misunderstanding and evolved into something that has changed both our lives forever. The Puma, who looked at me like he remembered, has taught me that love and loyalty can transcend species, and that sometimes the most meaningful relationships are the ones that challenge everything we think we know about the natural world. Thank you for listening to this incredible story of mistaken identity, wild nature, and the extraordinary bond that can develop between humans and the most unlikely companions. This tale reminds us that love and loyalty can transcend species boundaries, and that sometimes the most meaningful relationships challenge everything we think we know about the natural world. Scout's story shows us that intelligence, adaptability, and emotional connection exist throughout the animal kingdom in ways we're only beginning to understand, and that respect for wild nature can coexist with deep personal bonds. I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Please let me know what part of the world you're listening from, and share any experiences you've had with unusual animal companions or unexpected wildlife encounters that changed your understanding of the natural world. If this story amazed you and made you think differently about the relationships possible between humans and wild animals, please consider subscribing to the channel and sharing it with others. These stories matter because they remind us that the natural world is full of surprises, and that sometimes the most extraordinary relationships are the ones that shouldn't be possible according to everything we think we know. Until next time, remember that the most meaningful connections often come from the most unexpected places, and that sometimes what we think we're rescuing is actually rescuing us in return.